Okay. Excellent. Thank you again. So tonight we're going to get into some of my favorite tips and tricks. I am not claiming ownership of any of these. I think in knitting, we can agree that there are a lot of different ways to get to the same place, which I love because some things don't work for some people. For example, a yarn over. A yarn over is an increase, but it makes a hole. A yarn over is great for lace, but you don't want to make a yarn over if you're making an increase on a sleeve because it's going to have a hole. Many different ways to increase. So this class, really what I'm doing is I'm pulling out my favorite ways to do some of these things and applying them to where you're specifically going to use them in knitting. Some of them you'll know. It would be, I don't think I've ever had anyone who knows everything. So we're waiting for that day. But a lot of these are going to be demonstrations. We have quite a big group today. I am going to have you do a couple of the things. But the best part is that it's recorded. Quite honestly, if there's any class to be recorded, it's this one, because there's so many things here. And it's so many little things that you really need to see. I can't just like put on a handout. So I'm happy to do that for you. You are going to sometime tomorrow receive an email with a link to YouTube with the recording, and there will be a password. So that is for you. So without further ado, I'm going to flip my camera around and we are going to go straight to the basics. And that is when we cast on. So my favorite generic cast on, and when I say generic, I mean the cast on that, you know, if you were to tell me to cast on 20 stitches, it's the cast on I would go to, right? And that would be the long tail cast on. And I have quite a few things to say about the long tail cast on, because number one, most knitters will start their cast on with a slip knot. And I do not make a slip knot because I believe that there are no knots in knitting. So I do not start my long tail cast on with a slip knot. What I do is I drape the yarn over my thumb and my index finger, and I pull the needle down and towards me until I have what I call my slingshot, and I twist up. So again, down, twist. I'm holding the stitch with my index finger so it doesn't fly off. Now I'm going to go straight into my long tail cast on, up, around, through. And I'm automatically going to have 2 stitches on the needle. So again, specifically for the recording, I am going to drape the yarn over my thumb and my index finger. I am going to press down and twist up and go up, around, through. And now I have 2 stitches and no slip knot. Okay. So you do the long tail cast on. This is what we are used to doing. And we continue. There is another way to do the long tail cast on, and I'll show that briefly. If you ever see someone going like this, they wrap the yarn around their thumb, they almost knit it on. This is the English way of doing the long tail cast on. I've always found it fascinating that we learn the long tail cast on the European way, which is like this, the yarn in our left hand. So this would be like the continental way of knitting, when you knit and you hold the yarn in your left hand. And this would be the English way. I wrap it around my thumb and I knit it on. However, the important thing to note here is that it does the exact same thing. You can't tell where I did one or the other, because here, if I put words to it, up, around, through, and here, up, around, through. It's the exact same thing, just different way to getting there. All right. So I love the long tail cast on, but my problem with it is that it has a right side and a wrong side. When you do the long tail cast on, when you're casting on, you are casting on the right side of the work, which is wonderful. Except when we go to do our first row of knitting and our pattern starts with a knit row, I turn it around and now I have all these bumps. So what happens is that knitters usually go to start knitting row 1, stockinette, and what you're doing is you're knitting on the wrong side of the cast on, and you're going to end up with a bunch of bumps like this on the right side of the work, okay? So we have a couple of options here. Option number one.
Very cut through.
Option number one here is after I do my cast on, I can purl a row, okay? And I'm just doing a clean purl row to reverse the knitting. A little bit of confusion comes in here where people ask me, you know, does this count as row one? It's the pattern. Does your cast on count as row one? So if you're going to use this tip here where you purl a fresh row, I like to say that none of this counts as anything. You cast on, you purl a row, now you're ready to work row one, and now we have the right side of the cast on the right side of the work. However, this is not the way that I usually do my long tail cast on, because just like we have a long tail cast on knit, which is this, we also have a long tail cast on purl. So I'm going to hold my yarn the same way, but now I'm going to follow my index finger straight up behind. I'm going to come under that middle bar and I'm going to drop my needle right back through this hole. Now it makes a purl stitch. You can see the little bump there. So again, I follow my index finger straight up, come under the middle bar and right back through. And I have little purl bumps. So the great thing about doing the long tail cast on purl is I am casting on the wrong side of my knitting. So you can see I'm making bumps. So now when I turn my work over and I go to do row one, I have the beautiful flat stitches facing and I'm ready to just start my knit row. Another thing that is wonderful about the long tail cast on purl is when you have the knowledge of both of them, you can cast on in pattern. I'm sure you've heard a pattern say bind off in pattern. If you're binding off, let's say the neck ribbing of a sweater, you're going to bind off knit two as if to knit and then two as if to purl. You know, you want the bind off to follow the flow of the stitches. Well, now I can cast on in pattern. Knit one, knit two, purl one, purl two, knit one, knit two, purl one, purl two. All right. So, great knowledge to have with the long tail cast on knit and purl. The next thing I want to address is the spacing, okay? There's a pretty big misconception here, and that is because when you want to bind off loosely, you might have heard someone to tell you go up a needle size, okay? And that does work. If you go up a needle size, because when you bind off, you're flipping each of these stitches over, and now they're gonna lay on their side. And the needle size is what makes the height of the stitch. So and when I say the height, look at the stitch going north and south. If I make a bigger needle, the needle's this big, now that stitch is going to be really tall. But they're still right next to each other. And the looseness of a cast on has to do with the spacing. It has nothing to do with the needle size. I've seen a tip where you can cast on over two needles like this. And then you pull one of the needles out, okay? These stitches are still right next to each other. They're just much taller, okay? And that's just gonna make for a loose and sloppy edge. So the spacing has to do with your index finger. So I'm gonna be a little dramatic here. I'm gonna go crazy. So I'm gonna put my finger a few inches away and I'm gonna cast on a stitch and I'm gonna let that stitch just fall to my index finger. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now look how far apart they are, okay? I can't imagine a time in knitting you'd ever want your stitches this far apart, but this is just to show you it has nothing to do with the needle size, it's the spacing of the stitches. So In the real world, when I'm casting on, I cast on, notice where my index finger is. My index finger is here, so these stitches can't slide off the needle. And when I go to cast on a stitch, I just let that stitch fall right to my finger, right there. And then I move my finger in front and I keep on going. That one index finger is going to give you the proper amount of spacing where your stitches are not too tight, but it has nothing to do with the needle size. It's the spacing of the stitches that's going to make the looseness of the cast on. Okay. Wonderful. Do we have any questions on any of that so far? Don't expect you to just try the long tail purl and to remember it. It's one of those things that until it becomes muscle memory, you're going to want to check the recording. Okay.
I have a question, Keith. So if you cast on a little bit loosely, just like you showed, then you wouldn't need to use the smaller needle for your swatch like a pattern normally says.
A smaller needle in what sense?
Well, you know how sometimes it'll say use such and such a needle to get gauge.
So a smaller needle is going to make the knitting tighter.
Right,
so you still want to make a smaller needle, like say you're doing the ribbing on a sweater, because if you think of a gauge swatch, every time you go down a needle size, it's going to make the knitting tighter and smaller. But I'm just talking about for the actual cast on, those original loops you were putting on the needle, it's going to be the spacing that's going to determine how the rest of the knitting comes out.
Okay.
If I cast on really tight, my knitting is going to flare out, but the bottom will be really scrunched and tight. So it's just that initial row of casting on.
Okay, thanks.
Great question.
Keith, it's Marcy. Yeah. If you're casting on in the round, right? And I mean, you're gonna go start in the round, or isn't it going to also be a purl that you're looking at if you cast?
No, if you're casting on in the round, you're going to want to use the knit one because you're always facing the right side. Does that make sense?
I'm thinking about it. Yeah. So always use the knit one, even if what happens if you're starting, if you're doing a rib, can you do?
You could do the knit and purl. Absolutely.
You actually do that whenever you do a rib?
Oh yeah, because I want my rib to follow from the very beginning. I just want it to the bumps to grow out of nowhere. Okay. As opposed to having a line.
Thank you.
Margaret?
English style to do the purl.
English style to do the purl. I don't know if I've ever gotten that question. Let me take a peek. Great question. Okay, so yarn comes to the front. Okay. Tested my brain out here. So the yarn comes to the front. So instead of wrapping the yarn this way, I'm going to wrap it the other way, and I'm going to come through the back. That's going to put the twist in, and I'm going to purl the stitch on. Yeah. So the back, purl the stitch on.
Excellent, thank you.
All right. So you just, when you're doing it the English way, you just want to like treat it almost like a stitch. All right, wonderful. So now I'm going to move on to just a couple of my cast on tips for in the round. Okay. So when we are knitting in the round, one thing that has always bothered me are these gaps. Okay. We get the gap at the cast on and we get a nice big one at the bind off. All right. And as you might imagine, this is because when we're knitting in the round, we're always knitting one row on top of the next. They're continuous rounds. All right. So if I were to continue knitting this, it would close over the gap until I get back to where I started and I'd have the gap again. Right. Also right at the very beginning. So here is what I do when I cast on. To fix the gap in the beginning, it's done in the knitting. To fix the gap at the end, it's done in the finishing. Right. So when I go to cast on, I recommend casting on an extra stitch than what your pattern calls for. It does not matter what the pattern calls for. If the pattern calls for casting on 30 stitches, you're gonna cast on 31, right? And we're gonna use that extra stitch to our advantage here. The very first thing we're gonna do is slip the first stitch purlwise. Okay,
You want to go outside?
a moment. All right, so I slipped that first stitch purlwise, then I will put my marker for the beginning of the round. And now I'm gonna work all the way around, whatever my pattern says. And then when I get to the first 2 stitches before the marker, I work all the way around. I'm gonna work these together, whether it's a knit 2 together or a purl 2 together. And what you're doing here is you're knitting the first stitch of the round together with the last stitch of the round. And that's gonna close the little gap. So we cast on an extra stitch. The reason we slip a stitch first and then place our marker is so our marker is not in between those 2. I'm gonna just show that one more time. Cast on an extra stitch, slip the first stitch purlwise, place my beginning of the round marker. Then I'll work around my needle. And when I come all the way around, I'll work the first and the last stitch together. And that will close the gap. Now, when we bind off, we have this pretty big gap. And I would assume that most of us just take our tail and try to close the gap the best, the best we can. But I'm going to show you the proper way of recreating the stitch there. So I fasten off, leaving about a 6-inch tail. And I thread the yarn onto my darning needle. And I'm going to go under both legs of the very first stitch of the round. My darning needle. And now I'm going to go under just the back leg of the very last stitch of the round. I'm going to pull that tight, find my tension. Now it's continuous. If you look at the top, I recreated that stitch, so it just looks like all the other V's. Okay. Yes, Joyce, it is like magic. Okay. And man, this swatch has been taken out and put back together a million times. I'm going to do it one more time here. Here's what it looks like. This is pretty high. It's almost like half an inch off. Okay, I'm going to thread my darning needle. We're going to go under both legs, the very first stitch. Just the back leg of the very last stitch. And voila. Okay. So those are my tricks for in the round. And now we're going to move on to this guy. All right. Just give me a nod if you've seen the staircase bind off before. Okay. All right. It looks like the majority of us have seen it. Okay. So it's very rare for me to say I'm never going to use something because I feel like in knitting, there's always a place for something. But I really hate this thing. I hate the staircase. And I'm going to show you why. Now, remember, I am or was the finishing guy for a lot of years. So the staircase is never, or it shouldn't be on a sweater, unless I don't want to contradict myself here. Maybe if like you had a design element at the bottom of the sweater where you wanted stair steps, but usually it's a shaping technique. All right. And we're going to see the stair step at the shoulders or at the neck or at the armhole or on the sleeve cap. You're going to see it a lot on the sweater. And this is the problem. The problem is you're not actually looking at the stair step. What the stair step is going to do is when you seam, it's going to look like this. When you seam, you're going to see everything below my knitting needle. So see how these stitches just beautifully graduate up, okay? And the stair step is going to go into the seam. But because we have this jagged edge, it makes a very uneven and bulky, thick seam. All right. So I am going to show you the sloped bind off. I'm going to have you do this one with me. We're going to attempt to do it together in such a large group. And we are going to do that, and we're going to see a much smoother edge. If you are not familiar with the staircase, this happens when we bind off consecutively. So, for example, if a pattern were to tell me to bind off 3 stitches every right side row, I would bind off 3, knit across, purl back, bind off 3, knit across, purl back, and so on. The bind offs are right on top of each other. If my pattern said bind off 3 stitches at the beginning of every 4th row, bind off 3, knit across, purl, knit, purl, bind off 3, then you're just doing your regular bind off. The sloped bind off is going to only be when your bind offs are right on top of each other. So I'm going to ask everyone to cast on 12 stitches and just do a knit row and a purl row. Give you a couple of moments to do that. Sloped bind off is one I use a lot now. Ever since I learned it, I have not gone back to a stair step. It's just going to be a much smoother transition. While you're doing that, I'm going to take a peek to see who's in the room. I'm trying to keep the majority of the class on speaker view, so when you have the recording, you have me as the big screen. Deborah, 12 stitches will be fine. I just wanted to get a little taste of it. Terry, I love your shirt. That's awesome. I was laughing with all of the donations. I tried to Venmo Natalia, but I apparently have never set up my bank account on Venmo, so it was going to take a fee. So then I was going to Zelle the money, but there's a limit, so I would have had to do like $1,000 a day for the week. So then Chuck finally just did it. All right. So I'm going to do a full demonstration of this. It's not hard, but there's a couple of steps, and in a class setting of 20, sometimes there's a little confusion. So I just want to offset that with 50 plus. So I'm going to do a full demonstration of how this is done, and then I'm going to have you test it out, and I'll take questions. So what I'm going to have you do on this little swatch in a moment is basically, just like I was saying before with the stair step, I want us to bind off 3 stitches at the beginning of every right side row, which would mean bind off 3, knit across, purl back. Bind off 3, knit across, purl back. Every right side row, we bind off 3. However, we are going to use the sloped bind off. When we are doing the sloped bind off, and I'll have a handout for this when I send you a link to the recording, okay? But you also have it on the recording. When we are doing the sloped bind off, we always do the very first bind off as we normally would. So here, I'm going to bind off 3 stitches. And I'm going to knit across. So nothing here has changed. Smooth sailing so far. I'm now ready to turn my work and purl back. And I am going to purl until I reach the very last stitch, and that's where things are going to change. So I did the first bind off as I normally would. Purling back. Pat. So when I get to the very last stitch, I'm just going to slip it purlwise. I'm not going to work the last stitch. And now I'm ready to bind off 3 again. But watch how I do the very first bind off. I'm going to slip the first 2 stitches purlwise, and I'm immediately going to pass 1 over. And that counts as my first bind off. So that's 1. And now I'm going to do another 2 the regular way. Knit, pass, 2, knit, pass. And that's 3. And I'm going to repeat it one more time for you. I'm going to finish knitting my row. Purl back. And I'm going to purl until I reach that very last stitch. Slip that last stitch purlwise. Turn my work. And I'm ready to bind off 3 again. Very first thing I do is I slip the first 2 stitches purlwise. I immediately pass 1 over. I don't knit anything. That counts as my first bind off. And then I do my next 2 the regular way. So I want you to give that a try. If you get lost in the steps, just call out to me. And it's called the sloped bind off. I think they should have called it the ski slope bind off because it reminds me of a little ski slope. And I'm going to finish mine up and we'll compare them. I almost just cut the cord of my needles. That wouldn't have been fun. I'm going to give everyone a few more moments to play with that one. It is smooth, Debbie. I love it, but it really makes the difference for the seaming. Anybody have any questions on this? Got those steps down? All right, good.
Can you explain why it works? Why the slanting works?
So I'm not gonna, Shayna would be your go-to for drawing this out. But what we're doing is we're pulling that last stitch up and over. So you're going to see it's elongated because we're stretching it up over a row, but we're pulling it up and over. And it's almost like it's skipping half a row instead of 2 rows. And you're going to notice you have an elongated stitch. Every time I did it, I have an elongated stitch, but that's okay because that all goes into the seam. Remember, this is just for a clean seam. So here, it's going to look like that when I'm seamed. And here where we stretch that stitch up over the row, it looks like that. So we see that huge difference there. I mean, that's a big difference. It's nice and clean, a nice straight edge. Okay.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I love this one. This almost looks like a little wedge. Here we have a very jagged line. So again, the place you're going to use a sloped bind off is only when you're binding off right on top of the last bind off. Okay. If there's any row between, even if it's one plain clean row, then you are not using the sloped bind off. It's only when they're on top of each other. Because you're pulling that last stitch up and over. Right. So this is going to be a fun one because I know I see a lot of faces of people who have taken this class 30 times. And this is one I threw in for this evening. It's going to be a demonstration. This I love. Okay. I have a question here. When Katie's asking in the chat what happens when you bind off on the purl side, it's going to be the same thing. You'll slip the stitch purlwise, same exact thing. Good question. Always slip. Primarily in knitting, you want to slip your stitches purlwise because if you slip them knitwise, you're going to twist a stitch. So unless the pattern specifically tells you to slip a stitch knitwise, you just want to auto-tune to always think that if you see slip a stitch, instead of asking yourself, do I slip it as if to knit or purl, purlwise, because otherwise it will twist the stitch. But other than that, it will be exactly the same thing. Great question. I love, I love knitting. We all love knitting. We're all here. I love a knitted fabric. I actually prefer the act of crocheting. And when I say that, I prefer the motion of actually doing it. It's just more rhythmic to me. But I do prefer a knitted fabric, but there are cases where I prefer a crochet border. For example, on my Lizard Ridge afghan here, you will notice it's black, but I crocheted my border, okay? And I did scallops here. This is actually what the pattern called for. It's for the scallop border, which kind of matches the ridges in the afghan. And the reason you could assume that we do not see a lot of crochet mixed into knitting patterns is because if you're a knitwear designer, you want to sell your pattern, and most knitters run when they see the word crochet hook, okay? However, there are great places to use it on knitting. I will always prefer a crocheted neck or crocheted borders on top of knitted ones. They're a little more substantial, where for the body of something like a sweater, I would want a knitted fabric. But crochet does have a different gauge than knitting. So the great thing is a lot of knitters know how to do a single crochet. If anything, I hear, do you knit or crochet? Like, oh, single crochet is the extent of my crochet skills. Well, that's great because that's all you really need to know for this. So I'm going to show you how to properly attach your crochet to your knitting, right? And this is, if you know single crochet, this is great. If you don't, I am planning later this winter to do a whole entire crochet event to like a little master crochet series from scratch. All right. So I'll give you some of my picking up stitches tips later. So I don't want to get too much into that, but when we pick up stitches, the formula for stockinette stitch is we want to pick up 3 stitches for every 4 rows. All right, and this all has to do with our knitting gauge versus our stitch gauge versus our row gauge. If I were to pick up knitting in every single hole, okay, I'm just going to do a few of them here to give an example. If I were picking up stitches, I went into every single one of these holes. If you were in last night's finishing class, then you might remember that our row gauge is pretty much always going to have more rows in a square inch than stitches. You think of a gauge swatch, 18 stitches in 24 rows equals 4 inches. Okay, 24 rows, 18 stitches. More rows in per square inch than stitches. So here I'm picking up against the row gauge, but my new knitting is going to be the stitch gauge. Okay, the whole point of picking up is so we can get our knitting to go the other direction. Okay, so if I were to pick up in the, I'm picking up in the row gauge. If I pick up in every single row, my new piece of knitting is going to flare out. There's going to be too many stitches to accommodate all the rows. All right, so when this translates to crochet, I want to pick up in every other row. So I like to start somewhere near but away from the corner. I'm going to put my hook in, pull my yarn through, and I am going to single crochet. I call this a base. No matter what stitch you want to do, when you're attaching crochet to knitting, you want to do a base of single crochet. So here, I'm going to skip a hole and I'm going to single crochet. Okay. And every other hole is the formula on the side of stockinette that is going to make your crochet gauge match your knitted gauge. Okay. If we were picking up stitches, it would be 3 stitches to every 4 rows. Here, it's every other row. And I'm going to work my way up. Now I'm ready to go in that corner stitch. Yep.
If I just had a question, when you're saying it's every other row, is that if your crochet hook is the same size as your needle was?
Yes, and primarily you're going to, you know, if I were doing fingering weight yarn, then I might
Yeah.
need to go in every other hole.
Yeah,
But
okay.
usually if your gauge is the same or close,
Close to it. Okay, thank you.
absolutely. You know, if you went down a size or for something for like the neck, it would still be the same. All right. In the corner, I want to do 3 single crochets, and that is an increase in crochet, but really what it equates to is I have my tail there. I'm gonna single crochet 3 times. 1, 2, 3. 3 times in that same hole. And what that does is it turns the corner. Okay. So every other hole, you can see how beautifully it's matching. It's not blocked yet, but it's matching wonderfully there. And now across the stitch gauge, because remember, I was going against the row gauge. Now I'm going across the stitch gauge, and it's going to be every 3rd hole. So if it's every 3rd hole, you're going to be getting a stitch. And this is what a stitch in knitting looks like. It looks like a little heart. Okay. And then if I go every 3rd, the next one is going to be a little arrow pointing up, which is what I call the V. And what that is half of one stitch and half of another stitch. It's going to be half, it's going to be the right leg of this stitch and the left leg of this stitch, all right? So if you like to think of them as holes, 1, 2, 3. One, 2, 3. So this is a little V. The next one will be a heart. 1, 2, 3. A little heart. And I'm just going to do a few more here. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. There's so much you could do with crochet when it comes to borders. So then I would do 3 in my corner and every other hole going down, 3 in my corner, every third hole going across the cast on. And that would be my base crochet. Then I could do whatever stitch I want after that. So the one I just did here, after it's done and blocked, here would be one example. Okay, it's hard to see my stitches there. Let me see if I can get better light. There we go. Okay, so you can see how beautifully that attaches. There's no puckering. The knitting's not stretched out like this. It's not scrunched in. It will be a very puckered and scrunched before it's blocked. But that base is how I applied it onto my knitting. Then you could do whatever you want after that. So I love mixing knitting and crocheting, but there is a little tip there for how to apply it to the knitting because you are messing with gauges there. Does anybody have any questions on this? And all I did there was single crochet. Again, you want to do single crochet as your base. On this one in particular, after I did my base, I did a round of half double, then I did a round of double, and then I did a round of triple. And that's how I got this graduating look. Beautiful. All right. Moving right along. I am going to ask you to cast on 8 stitches. And if you're wondering, this is that favorite little thing I love to teach. So if you know what I'm talking about, you're just going to be reminded of how much you love it, hopefully. And if you haven't done it before, you're going to be in for a surprise. But I want you to cast on 8 stitches and just work in stockinette stitch. Okay? So a few rows, knit a row, purl a row. Debbie, I'm seeing your comment here. I don't know if I can. I feel like, you know, when I was doing finishing so many times, I would crochet a neck instead of knit. You know, when I had the type of knitter, the customer that would send me something and say, do whatever you think looks great. That's when I would do it, you know, not when it called for knitting and the person was expecting a knitted border. But especially for blankets, baby blankets, I always do a scallop, a little crab stitch. I have a little swatch somewhere here. But I can't think of any designers offhand. I'll look into that a little bit more. But, you know, I would say there is a theme that most knitters are not crocheters, and you don't want to mix the two from a business sense. Here is my little crab stitch. I love doing this on baby blankets. So here, there we go. See how awesome of a border that is? Here I did my single crochet onto the knitting, just like I showed you. And then I did my crab stitch there on the edge. You are welcome.
Keith, this
Yeah.
is Kelly. While we're knitting here for a minute,
Of course.
on the cast on tips and tricks, do you, even if we cast on in pattern, do you still consider any cast on work not part of the pattern regardless? Yeah,
Correct.
okay,
Yes.
okay, thank you.
And that's, just my personal view on it. I like to let the cast on be the cast on, but I do like to think about what the first row is going to be. So specifically for the long tail, I can get that, I can get the right side to line up with the right side of the cast on to line up with the right side of the knitting.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
You are welcome. Oh, wonderful. Maureen is saying she put crochet edge on knitting in the advanced search bar on Ravelry and got some results. We'll have to take a field trip in a little bit over to Ravelry and see what we find. One thing I do love about crochet is, I always say this, you can get that spider web look. You can't get that with knitting, that like very dramatic webby look. Crochet lace.
I'm trying to find the pattern where I did this before, but for blanket borders, there was one pattern years and years and years ago where the crocheted edge took the 5 or 6 colors that were actually used in the blanket and created a twisted look with all 5 colors.
That's really cool.
It was really cool. I want to find it again for another blanket I'm doing now.
You can make the whole look of an item just by the border. If you really wanted to make it my type of project, it would be a stockinette blanket with a really intricate crochet border. Right. So I'm going to ask you to finish on a purl row. So you want to purl the row. You want to be ready to do a knit row. So finish purling. Okay. I am going to bind off my little swatch here. I just want you to watch. So when I bind off, just going to do my regular bind off. And you know what? There's actually a couple of tricks in itself here. That edge stitch of your knitting, let's get into that. I'll move this out of the way here so I can get better lighting. If you notice that your edge stitch is loose, one of the things you might want to do is when you go to knit that first stitch, so you want to pull that tight, okay? And it's not really doing anything. You need to put your needle into the second stitch in order to tighten the first stitch. Now this will really tighten. So when you put your needle into the second stitch, it unlocks the first stitch. This is especially helpful when knitting with double pointed needles, because often when double pointed needles, in between the needles, you get a ladder, all right? As you're knitting, this happens automatically. All right, the third stitch will automatically tighten the second stitch. The fourth stitch will tighten the third stitch. But when I get to the end, there is no one here to tighten the last stitch. And if you see, it's loose here. But that's fine. Because when I go to purl, I purl the first stitch, okay? And it's still loose. But I put my needle into the second stitch. Now watch what happens when I pull the yarn. Tightens everything up. You see how much that tightened? But it only works when the needle is in the next stitch. It's just the anatomy of how knitting works. All right. So that's how you get those nice clean edges. You want to pull the yarn tight when your needle is in the second stitch. All right. But that's not my main goal with this swatch. So I'm going to take this out. I'm just going to take out a row here, so I'm on the right side. And now I'm going to bind off these stitches. And when I get to the last stitch, I'm going to fasten off. All right, and I bound off. So when we bind off, we get this very loose edge at the edge stitch, okay? And that is because I was telling you, as we're knitting and we're going along, every stitch tightens the one before it, but there's no one left to tighten this stitch, so it's loose. So the trick is we're gonna lift the leg from the row below up, and we're gonna tighten up that stitch. I'm going to change colors here and hope I don't have that layer. I'm going to move the camera here. There we go. So I'm going to give this a demonstration and then I'm going to have you do it. 2, pass over. Knit 1 and pass. Knit, pass. Knit, pass. Okay. And I am going to slip my last stitch purlwise. Okay, so I bound off until I reached the last stitch. I'm going to slip the last stitch purlwise. With my left hand needle, I'm going to lift the leg from the row below. It's on a little slant there. Okay, here it is. I'm going to lift that leg and I'm going to slide the last stitch back to the left hand needle. I am going to knit those two together. Let the lifted leg with the last stitch. And now I'm going to pass over and fasten off. Probably be helpful if I cut my yarn. Now I do not have that loose edge. Goes perfect all the way across every time. Right. My favorite little trick in the whole class. So I'm going to take this out and I'm going to do it again. And if you want to do it with me this time, we'll go step by step. So you are going to bind off until you reach the very last stitch. When you reach the last stitch, you're going to slip it purlwise. So you're not going to work that last stitch. You're just going to slip this purlwise. And then here I go with lifting the leg. It's on a slant. I always say you are lifting it correctly. It's from the back to the front. If you were to do it incorrectly from front to back, your entire wrist would have to be twisted. Right, so if you're using your left-hand needle, chances are you're picking it up correctly. We're going to pick up that leg on the slant, slide the stitch back, knit them together, the lifted leg with the stitch, pass over. Now we can fasten on. And usually it doesn't look as good the second time because I've stretched the stitches out, but here, let's say it looks just as good. Give you a few more moments to play with that one. Worth the price of admission. I get that one a lot. I love this one because, you know, when I took the tail with the swatch that was in the round and I used the tail and I showed you how to recreate that stitch, that one works beautifully. But with that loose edge stitch, when you take the tail and you try to fix that loose edge stitch, you're just like in an endless hole of making it worse. But here, when you look, I see people nodding because it's true. It's like, but when you lift that leg, it tightens it all up. Okay. Okay. All right, now we're gonna have a little discussion about blocking. Who loves blocking? Who says blocking is their favorite thing to do? All right. So I feel like there's a misconception with blocking. First of all, the funny thing is when I was doing finishing, you would be amazed at how much blocking I would get, just tails and blocking. It wasn't even just seaming sweaters. It was just opening boxes of shawls to be blocked. And I couldn't get it at first, but then I realized that when you're knitting something like a lace shawl and you bind off it, you're proud of it and it's beautiful, but it's all scrunched up. And then you would send it to me and some kind of magic would happen. And when you go to open it again, you know, I was never on the receiving end of opening the block shawl. In your head, you're, you know, envisioning what it looked like when you sent it, and then you get it and it's dramatically transformed. And I would say 80% of my blocking is and was always a garment steamer. I know I have a few people in this room that can attest to the garment steamer. So I want to go over the garment steamer and the power it has and what to do and where to do it and why to do it and how to do it. So first of all, the garment steamer is the one I use is Steam Fast. It's available on Amazon. Looks like this. Quite honestly, I had a sharper image one when I had first moved to Florida that I put in the car that was put on the truck. And when it finally broke, I just went onto Amazon and I really was just looking for the cheapest one I could find. And it turned out to be my favorite. Maybe it's just over the years that they've, you know, advanced because it heats up so fast. But the garment steamer it's a different steam than your iron. When you hit the iron button and it just kind of poofs, that's not really doing anything. This is a constant flow of steam coming out. It's hot. However, the steam can touch your knitting. as long as it's a natural fiber. So merino, alpaca, cashmere, all of your animal, basically, if it has a head, silk from a worm, if it has a head, the animal had a head, you can touch the steamer to the fabric. If it has acrylic in it, you don't, technically I do, but I don't touch it. I let it, like, I cover it over the fabric because acrylic will melt. So I'm going to go over what I won't use the steamer. It's acrylic. Yeah, a blend is fine. If it has a little acrylic, just be careful. That's really the one. Nylon's okay. Nylon is a very interesting man-made.
It's nylon.
So nylon's okay.
It's just sock yarn.
Yep, nylon's fine. The funny thing is nylon also takes acid dye, which is very interesting because it's a man-made fiber and acid dye is for the animal fibers, but nylon takes the acid dye beautifully. So nylon's fine. It's really just acrylic because acrylic will, like, the knitting, when I say melts, it does physically melt, but it flattens and then it's pretty much ruined. You want to be careful with that. If you are going to block linen, okay, if your piece, I always say, if your piece is 50% linen or more, it needs to go in the washing machine. Okay, that's the way you're blocking it. I know there's a lot of fear about putting stuff in the washing machine, but linen, I'm telling you, I tell people you can run it over with your car. The more you beat it up, the softer it gets. And also your tension evens out and it's beautiful. I love linen. So linen, you're putting it in the washing machine, then lay it flat to dry. That's how you're blocking it. That's it. Let's see. The farm yarns, the rougher wools, okay, that is when I'm going to tell you to wet block, okay, because that really softens up the fiber. Cotton, you can use the steamer, even though it doesn't have a head. But yes, you can use a garment steamer on cotton. So any of the rougher wools, I'm thinking that Afghan I held up is Noro. Curion, which is definitely a much rougher wool, but any of those, I don't want to name brands here, but anyway, when you hand wash something like that, I'd recommend putting a little hair conditioner in, and that really softens them up, gives them a little bit of a halo. But other than that, everything else, I use a garment steamer. I'm not a big fan on wool washes. There's one I love. It's called Kookaburra. And it smells so good. And I use it in the dye studio, mostly if it's something from me, because without naming brands, because I don't need to, they pull the color out. They do. I actually use a wool wash to clean some of my pots because it does a great job at taking the dye off. And I always say, what's the huge deal if a little color comes out? It's not like you're going to strip all the color off the piece. But if you made a shawl or a sweater that's white and a red border, and the red bleeds onto the white, it's going to turn it pink. Then it's a problem, okay? If you're washing a blue sweater and a little blue comes off and it's not in with anything else, that's okay. So that's where, I say be careful with the wool washes. So again, for myself, where I know if a little color comes out and it's fine, that's fine. But I don't want to rinse the yarn that I just dyed with a wool wash. And I in the very beginning, I was. But that strips when you dye yarn, you use citric acid or vinegar to chemically bond the dye molecules to the fiber. And when you use a wool wash, which is a detergent, you're chemically unbonding the dye molecules to the fiber. I've watched, there's someone on YouTube who's done experiments setting up like all different brands of wool wash, Dawn dish soap, shampoo, hair conditioner. Every single one pulled the color out except a bucket of just water. All right. I do recommend, if you do want to get something in there to, clean it as a soap, I recommend Johnson & Johnson baby shampoo. Okay. It's gentle. If it's gentle enough for a baby, it's fine for your knits. So Carrie's asking, what about washing it in cold water with white vinegar? So that's wonderful. Except the vinegar does not work unless heat is added. So if you really wanted to do that and set it, what you would want to do is you would want to put it in a pot of water on the stove with the vinegar in it, heat it to almost a boil, and then let it naturally cool back to room temperature before you touch it. Okay, so vinegar is great, but it really doesn't, the chemistry doesn't happen until the heat is applied.
Okay, what about this? I've got like a, it's multicolored, like some of them are light, some of them are dark, so just steam block it instead.
Oh, yes. Yep.
Okay.
And I'm going to show you the steaming. I'm
Awesome.
going to give you a little example of the steam just on yarn, because this is a tip within itself. But you will be amazed. The steam will change your life. So I'm going to plug this in. And steam is also great. You have to freshen up your yarn. Has anyone here ever had to rip something out? Hands up if you've ever had to rip something out. Okay, that's everyone in the room. Okay, if you're me, you're ripping more than you're knitting. So it's wonderful that in knitting we can rip out and reuse the yarn. However, when you rip out, the yarn is kinked like this, okay? And the problem is when you go to reknit with the yarn kinked like that, your tension is awful. You row out, and that's when, like, if you're knitting stockinette, when you turn it over, the lines aren't even, there's like little spaces in them. It doesn't knit evenly, okay? That's not to say the yarn is ruined, especially if your piece was already blocked, because what the steaming does, or if you wet block, is it sets the stitches in place. When you're knitting and your stitches look like this, they're kind of like this. And then when you block them, they relax. All right. So I'm going to show you my piece here. I am just going to wrap this over my cat's little Yarn Snob Yarn CEO sign. And I'm going to show you how I get this back. Steaming. So I am going to heat up the steamer. It's going to take just a minute to kick in. And we're going to show you how we block this. The steam is also great because the piece will be a little damp, but it'll be no way wet. In 10 minutes, it'll be dry.
Will that be enough time to pin it out?
So the interesting thing is that if you're steaming a superwash yarn, it's really cool because you can actually see the stitches expand without, even if you don't touch the steamer. Once the heat gets close enough, all the stitches start going like this, they move. So when I block, I pin it out and I steam it, but I only let it sit for a moment or two. Then I unpin it, because if you leave it pinned, then you get those little divots where the pins were, and then you need to go back and steam it again. So after I steam it, I kind of flap it out and then lay it flat to dry. So here, steaming, I turn my camera around, and when the steam touches the yarn, it's going to flatten it back out.
Magic.
Yep, like magic. It takes 2 seconds. Look, and that's what's happening in your knitting. Look at the difference from here to here. Okay. So garment steamer, it's the best knitting invention. Best knitting investment there. Okay. All my yarn is just turning back. So when I'm, steaming a piece, well, steaming, now this of course has already been blocked. And just be careful because it is hot. The yarn will actually be steaming. Here's a great little example here. This border on my cowl is flipping up. It's a little too hot to touch, but 2 seconds it stopped.
Nice.
We're here, it's still flipped. So the steam is your best friend there. Yeah. And on something like a border like this, I would actually flip it to the inside, steam it where I put a little crease there. That'll really stop a border from rolling. So I recommend the garment steamer. I know there are some handheld ones as well, but it's amazing. There does come a time where you actually have to wash your piece, and that I understand. But for the initial blocking, the steam really sets this. I love the way it sets the stitches. So in the beginning, tread lightly. I don't want anyone to ruin anything until you get used to it. But I do touch it very close, if not to the knitting. Test it out on a small piece first.
How do you block large items like a blanket or something like that?
I block them in sections. No one ever said that you have to lay the entire thing out at once. You could block pieces of it. All right. So a shawl, especially like a lace shawl, I'll just focus on one section. And, I'm not letting it sit there for 24 hours. I'll steam it, unpin it, move it over, open up the next section, steam it, unpin it. So
You're a genius. That's a game changer for me, my friend.
It's not just that it's fast. That's just a bonus. It's the fact that, when we block, we're looking for 3 things. 1, we want to even out our tension. 2, we want to add the softness. Cashmere, my friend who owns a cashmere company will tell you that she steams everything over washing because the steam poofs the yarn. It pushes out the halo. It gives it the softness. So you're going to change the tension. You're going to change the feel, and then you're also going to get the drape. Now, you're not going to get that flimsy, floppy drape. Knitting is pretty stiff until it's blocked. That's when you get the flop, right? Can you put vinegar water? That's a great question because you do have the heat there. I don't want to say yes or no until I test that out, Debbie. Debbie is asking if you could put vinegar water in the steamer to help set the dyes. Quite honestly, when your yarn, the dye should be set. There's really no excuse coming from a dyer standpoint. Not to say that, all of my yarn doesn't bleed. The colors you want to watch out for, red is the number 1. Anyone who dyes yarn will tell you red is the color that bleeds. It's the chemical makeup of the color. So it's not necessarily the talent of the person dyeing. I recently found out that pottery glaze, red also is the color that bleeds if you do pottery, because it's the chemical makeup of the color. I also find some blues bleed. So those are the 2 colors, but I'm telling you, red is the one you want to watch out for. Fun fact, my happiness yarn that has 52 colors in it, I do not use red. Okay. There are colors that touch to make red, but I specifically do not use red dye because when I do and I rinse it, the whole thing just gets a red look to it because it bleeds all over all the other colors. Beth is saying she sprays her knits with water soak mixture in a spray bottle and then steam. So you could spray with water vinegar and not put the steamer directly. I would assume yes. I think that's a great idea. And I probably never thought about it because I use citric acid to set. And that's just from a standpoint of it's easier for me to lift because it's like salt in a cup or something. But yeah, I'm going to test that out because that would be a wonderful idea because you do, in order to set, you do need the heat. Anyway, do we have any other questions on blocking? Remember, linen, you want to put in the washing machine. You need the washing machine. The steamer is not enough. If you steam linen, it'll even it. It'll make your stitches pretty and even, but it's not going to give you that crazy flop because with linen, you need the agitation. So it's not just you want to put it in the washing machine. You want to put it in the washing machine with something like jeans or tennis balls or something that's really going to beat it up. Yeah. Wash out lanolin. That's when I would use a little Dawn dish detergent. A little squirt of Dawn because that takes the grease away. And I use that in the dye studio because the yarn comes dehydrated. You'd be very surprised if you saw what the yarn looks like before it's dyed. It looks like worsted weight looks like fingering weight because they suck all the moisture out. But also, the yarn is oily. It's oily. It has the lanolin, but it also it's mostly the oils from the machines at the mill when it's spin it. So I pre-wash all my yarn before it's dyed, and that water turns the filmy, oily, gross look. Yes, Carol, you could steam bamboo. You could steam animal or plant-based fibers. Okay. Wow, you guys are really onto the blocking. All right. Yes, Kathy, you need this. You do need distilled water in the steamer. I never actually really believed that, so I would just use water from the sink. And I went through so many steamers, and they get so moldy and disgusting. And then when I finally Chuck bought distilled water, and like we've had this one for years now, and it looks like the day I bought it. So I definitely recommend this distilled water. Wonderful. I am going to ask everyone to cast on 10 stitches, and we're going to work in garter stitch, knit every row. I believe this is the last time I'm going to be asking you to do the whole cast on thing. I know that gets a little annoying. And you know, that little piece of yarn that was all kinked that I showed you that I touched to the steamer and straightened out in 2 seconds. If it's doing that to kinked yarn, imagine what it's doing to your knitting, because it's just crazy how fast it transitions.
And then after you've done that steaming, you don't really need to lay it out at that point?
It will be damp. It's not going to be sopping wet, but it will be damp. So it does need to
Okay.
sit there and dry for an hour, at least.
That's a whole lot better than overnight.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And if you flop it around, it's pretty much ready to go. But it literally transitions before your eyes. I don't, funny because I just held up an entire Afghan in it, but normally I don't knit in a lot of the rougher yarns, but those, really do need to be hand washed and soaked in conditioner to get them to soften up. Beth just said, Keith, you make all this gorgeous yarn for us to knit with. We need to make it look good after we're done, which I think is funny because I have her stolen wrap right here, which looks incredible. So, and it was funny because I asked Beth to lend this to me, and Shayna said, you could just borrow mine. And I said, yeah, but Beth's is better. I'm so mean.
You know what, I did block that with my spray and method. Spray, and then I pinned it, I sprayed it, and then I steamed it.
It's gorgeous.
Yeah.
And it's nice and flat and drapey and soft. I mean, it's so beautiful. I love it.
Thank you for the yarn.
In fact, Chuck grabbed it and put it in his office, and I think it was yesterday, he said, I'm going to send this back to Beth. And I said, no, I need it for next week. Not yet.
Keep it as long as you need it.
I'm going to give you a few more moments to work on your garter stitch. So speaking about hurricane relief, the day after the hurricane, I stayed home because I wanted roads to get cleared. People need help. So the second day after the hurricane, I went to the orchid place, and I think I got there before all of them did. And they had 3 palm trees that fell in the greenhouse, and they were chainsawing that the day after the hurricane. But so like I was on cleanup crew, and I realized that you don't rake leaves in Florida, and that's where I got this blister on my hand. I spent like 9 hours. I also learned that I'm really out of shape. But I like raked the entire parking lot. And my friend Ashley, the owner's daughter, I made some comment about a leaf pile, and that's when I realized it doesn't exist. They don't know, like people don't know what a leaf pile is down here. So I was explaining to her that, like kids, that they go on the curb or the street by your house, and then kids like to jump in them, and you jump in a leaf pile. And, we were so exhausted, and it was so much work, but like the leaf pile was not very impressive. It was like 1 truck bed of leaves. Like it was like your standard leaf pile. And then like when we were done, I looked at her and I said, so imagine next week you have to do this all again, because the leaves don't just fall at once. Every week a few fall. So it was just funny seeing a perspective of someone who isn't used to raking leaves. I said, I've been prepared for this. All right. So I am going to show you the Icelandic bind off. This is a stretchy bind off. It won't appear to be too stretchy today on your just, a few stitches, but if we were binding off something like a shawl, it would be very stretchy. I only recommend it for garter stitch, and it's because it makes bumps, which is wonderful because garter stitch is made up of bumps. So if you're looking for a stretchy bind off for garter stitch, I recommend this. Over the years of doing finishing, I don't think I've ever gotten a garter stitch project that was bound off what I would say the proper tension. And that is because garter stitch has a much wider stitch gauge than, let's say, stockinette stitch. But when you bind it off, the stitches are still being bound off the same, and it scrunches the top in. So especially like something like a shawl, it's just you go to
He's
stretch
looking
it
for
out on the
nummies,
blocking
Daddy.
board. Something like a shawl, you go to stretch out on the blocking board, but you can't, it won't allow you to stretch because of the bind off. So I love this stretchy bind off for garter stitch. This is a good one that you're going to have for the recording because it is weird. I couldn't put it in a handout. It's just it's not hard. It's just a little awkward to explain. So I'm going to give it a demonstration, and then I'm going to have you give it a go. So I am going to knit a stitch. I'm going to slip the stitch back onto the left-hand needle, and then I'm going to knit this stitch through this stitch. So I knit a stitch, slide it back on the left-hand needle, and now I'm going to knit the second stitch through the first stitch. So to do that, I go into the first stitch as if it's the purl, and I knit the next stitch through it. Okay. And pull those both off. Okay. So again, I'm going to slide. I do it all in one motion. So I'm going to slide this stitch back and then knit the next stitch through the first stitch. Slide it back. And with my right hand needle, I go into the second stitch and knit it through. Slide it back. I keep knitting the stitch through the first stitch. After you knit it, you slide them both off. keep on going to that very last stitch, then you fasten off. You see here, it made a row of ridges. It is very stretchy. If you could see even on my little swatch here, it does. You can see how the stretch matches the cast on.
Keith, how do you do the last stitch? Just normal?
Yeah, so the very last stitch, you're gonna fasten off. I'll get mine back there. Okay, so here I just did the second to last. So I'm gonna slide it back. Knit this one through. Drop those off. And then when you have that very last single loop, you'll just fasten that off.
Keith,
Yep.
I knit in the back of the stitch normally. I'm left-handed and I can't seem to get it to look like yours.
Yeah. Hold on just a moment. Let me cast on a few stitches and see if I can figure out the combination method. I was just talking to someone the other day about new classes, and I said it would be great to make a whole class for combination knitters of how to reverse everything.
I would come.
Right? I think a lot of people would.
I would too. I'm a lefty,
Yep,
and I cast on with the yarn on my right hand, so I do everything backwards.
I think there's, it's not wrong. It's a different style of knitting.
Right.
And I think it's, got to be frustrating to come to these classes and to support teachers and designers. And it's, I'm here going to give it a try, but, just because they might not know off the bat, they can do some research.
I knit the same way you do. I just cast on with the yarn on my right hand, and I must have been taught that way as a kid, because I don't. It's, and then I have to teach myself how to do the purl one that you do, just by futzing around until I figured out how to do it.
Yeah.
With the yarns in the other hand. So it would be helpful, but there are YouTube videos for lefties.
There are, yes.
Yeah. I'd rather learn your tips and tricks.
Yes.
How does the first stitch work?
So you knit the first stitch the regular way and slide it back onto the left-hand needle.
Okay, thank you.
So let's see, I'm gonna see if I can figure this out here. Knit my first stitch. Okay, so it works. It's tricky because I'm going to slip the stitch back. And when you going into the back leg of the stitch, it's almost easier to take your finger and pick this over, because to get the tension here, I need to get that leg through, but there it is. I slide back. Now going into the back of the stitch, and you got to really twist.
You're still doing it right-handed though.
Oh, you're doing it from left to
I'm
left
doing
to
it
right?
from left to right.
Oh God, that I'm gonna. Who is writing me? Who's speaking?
This is Andrea Landis.
Andrea, I'm gonna take a note. I'm gonna get back to you after class because that's one I'm really gonna have to do research on. I thought you were doing it combination style. You're going.
No, I used to do combination and then I couldn't do lace. And if I do it where I completely reverse everything, my lace comes out fine.
So you are, when you're knitting, you're starting, hold on, let me make this bigger for myself.
I'm starting on the left
You're
side.
starting from here and going this way.
Mhm.
Okay, I'll send you an email. I'm gonna look into it.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Yes, Debbie, I see you have your hand up.
I'm a true lefty also, and all you have to do is mirror exactly what Keith does. So whenever he says left, you do right. Whenever he says right, you do left, and it will work.
Okay. That's wonderful knowledge. Does that make sense, Debbie? So when I say you're gonna knit one, so you're going from left to right, but that's the same. And then you're gonna take that stitch and you're gonna slide it back on your right hand needle and then knit the next one through it.
Exactly.
Okay, yep. See, my fear there with just wanting to test it out later is I wanted to make sure nothing was twisted going that way. But it does make sense that it would be just the reverse. Because usually it is, you know, if you're gonna do a knit two together from the pattern says that, then you would do a slip slip knit. All right. So that was the Icelandic bind off. And again, that is a stretchy bind off, but I only recommend it for garter stitch because it makes bumps. And, you know, I spent the whole first portion of the class showing you how to get your cast on of stockinette stitch to not have bumps. So usually we don't want bumps, but for garter stitch, it's good because it's made up of bumps. For a stretchy bind off, for anything else that's not garter stitch, and there are a lot of them out there, and I'm not going to say any of them are bad. It's just my favorite one is the Elizabeth Zimmerman sewn bind off. And when you do the Elizabeth sewn bind off, you are sewing your stitches off the needle. You are not binding them off the traditional way. So you want to cut a tail that's 3 times, at least 3 times the length of the piece you are going to bind off. More is always better. Okay. And this might remind you of Kitchener stitch. It is nowhere near as bad, I promise. So what you do for the Elizabeth Zimmerman sewn bind off is you go into 2 stitches as if to purl. And then you go back into the first stitch as if to knit. And you slide just that stitch off the needle. And then here, you do want to give it a little tension. If you see right here, when I give it tension, that's going to close up. If you don't give it that tension, it's going to look a little sloppy. We're definitely used to hearing a pattern say bind off loosely, but since here we're sewing off each individual stitch, we do want to give it a bit of tension there. And I repeat, I go into 2 as if to purl, pull my yarn through, back into the first stitch as if to knit, and off. 2 as if to purl, back into the first as if to knit, and off. 2 as if to purl, back into the first as if to knit, and off. 2 as if to purl, back into the first as if to knit, off. It's definitely very tedious, but it's so stretchy. It's like an accordion. So the wonderful thing about this bind off is that it stretches open, but then it closes again. So it is wonderful for something like the neck of a sweater. I always do this on the neck of a sweater. The great thing is it does not matter what the stitch pattern is. It's always the same. 2 as if to purl, back into the first as if to knit. Another place that's great is the top of socks. Stretch open over your feet and then close again. A place I would not use this is something like maybe a button band of a cardigan. And when you get to the very last stitch, you just go into that one as if to purl and pull off. It does, before it's blocked, it does curl forward. When it's blocked, That's what you're gonna see. Okay. But it's, again, very, very stretchy, matches the cast on. And that is the Elizabeth Zimmerman, can't get it to not curl. Sewn bind off, there it is. Oh, you know what? That's Marcy's saying, is the steamer still on? Let's give it a little steam. Okay, it's such a small piece. I don't know how well the steamer is going to do here, but we'll give it a try. The great thing is the steamer only takes 2 seconds to kick on. In the meantime, I'm going to ask everyone to cast on 8 stitches. I kind of lied. You are going to do one more. This is only if you want to do this, we're going to do an increase. Not mandatory, but if you want to cast on 8 stitches and work 2 rows, knit a row, purl a row. I am going to steam this little piece here. More curling. How flat that is. And also, unfortunately, you can't feel. I wonder if you could see. It has a halo. It poofs the fiber. Right. I'm going to cast on my 8 stitches as well. Remember, after you cast on 8 stitches, knit a row and purl a row. All right. So this is my favorite increase. It's an invisible lifted increase. We're going to apply it to a sleeve today. This is a tip within itself, so I'm going to show you this. A lot of times when we're going to make something, make a sleeve and we're going to increase, we're probably not going to do an increase like a yarn over that's going to make a hole. We might do something like a make one. And if I'm looking at my sleeve, okay, we know we have make one rights and make one lefts. So it's often assumed that you would do a make one right here and a make one left here. And technically that would be incorrect on a sleeve. On a sleeve, you want to do a make one left on the right and a make one right on the left. And that's because a sleeve gets folded in and we want our increases growing out from the center, not pointing towards each other like this. We want them growing out from the center of the sleeve. I do always say in my finishing classes that, you know, no one's going to come up to you on the street and say, turn your wrist over. I want to see which direction your increases are going. But you know, just to be pristine about it, you want to do your left on the right and your right on the left. If this were, let's say, the back of a sweater and I was doing body shaping, you would want to do the right on the right and the left on the left. Okay, it's just for a sleeve. The reason why I'm showing you this when we're going to do invisible lifted increases is because if you were to ask where you would use the invisible lifted increases, I would say anytime you would do a make one, you could substitute an invisible lifted increase. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's just more invisible. So I am going to follow it like a sleeve, and I'm going to do the left invisible increase on the right and the right one on the left. The very first one, I'm just going to give a full demonstration, and then we're going to try to do, this one's a little weird. We're going to try to do it together as a group, step by step. But first, I just want to get it in your head. So remember, you're going to have this on the recording, so you'll have the instructions there. So I'm going to, I always like to do my increases away from the edge. So I'm going to knit 2, and I'm going to do my invisible lifted increase left. So the first thing I'm going to do, and remember, you're just watching, I'm going to slip a stitch. We know we slip a stitch purlwise. And with my left hand needle, I'm going to pick up the left leg of the stitch I slipped. So here's the left leg. And I'm going to knit it through the back. Now I'm going to work to the last 3 stitches. I say the word work because it doesn't matter what stitch pattern you're in. Here we're in stockinette. So I only have to knit 2. And now I'm going to do the invisible lifted increase right. And to do the right one, it's the opposite. First, I'm going to lift the right leg of the next stitch right up onto the needle. I'm going to knit it the regular way. And then I'm going to slip the stitch. And we're always slipping purlwise. So I know there's a lot of steps there, but we're going to do it together one by one. So here, for the left one, I slip the stitch, lift the leg, knit it through the back. Here, I lift the leg, knit it regular, slip the stitch. So I am just going to, I don't want to stack my increases right on top of each other. So I'm just going to work 2 rows, and then we'll get it set back. It is important here that when you're purling back on the row after you do an invisible lifted increase, if you notice here, let me try to focus my camera a little bit better. I have 2 stitches coming out of 1. It is very easy to accidentally go into them as 1 stitch. You want to go into each one individually. Here again, I want to go into each single one because otherwise you'd accidentally just be decreasing them again. And I'm going to do a knit row and then a purl row, and then we'll be ready to do it together. We always want to do our increase or decreases at least 1 stitch in from the edge, and that will leave a nice clean stitch for seaming. Okay. We all ready? Nod if you're ready. Okay. Okay. So we are going to knit 2 stitches. And now we're going to do the invisible lifted increase left. So the next stitch you're going to slip, you will slip it purlwise. Now with your left hand needle, you're going to pick up the left leg of the stitch you just slipped. So from back to front, you're going to pick up the left leg and you will knit it through the back. Now you're going to knit into the last 3 stitches. Well done. Which is you're just going to have a couple of stitches.
Wow. All those hotels, huh?
Okay, now we're gonna do the invisible lifted increase right. So you're not gonna work anything with your right hand needle. You're gonna pick up the right leg below the next stitch on the needle, right here. We're gonna pick up the right leg and you're just gonna lift it straight up onto the needle. So again, the right leg, lift it straight up. And you're going to knit that stitch the regular way. And what you're doing is you're knitting that lifted leg. Now you slip the stitch. So you slip it purlwise. And then you're going to knit the last two. We're going to do another one of those together, but we do have to get a few rows away from the increase. So I want you to purl a row, knit a row, purl a row. You're going to work 3 plain rows. Remember that when you're purling back after the increase, you're going to purl 2, and that's where your increase is going to be. You want to make sure you get into each leg individually. You don't want to accidentally purl them together. I'm going to give everyone a few moments to finish that so we could do it together as a team. We'll do one more increase row. I'm going to show you here on my other swatch, which is blocked. Now you do have to remember, we're doing these increases very close together, but look at how they just grow. Isn't that beautiful? You know, with the make ones, well, the knit front and back, you get a purl bump. So I really don't ever recommend that in stockinette stitch. But if you're increasing in rib, I will only recommend a knit front and back because you're going to be you're incorporating the purl bump into the rib. When you do a make one, what you're doing is you're twisting the leg in between the stitch and you're kind of distorting it because in order to get that twist, you're pulling slack from one stitch to the right and one stitch to the left in order to get enough slack to twist it. And here you could see one here, you could see one here, you could see one here, you could see one here. But the invisible lifted increase gives you a graduated look. They just graduate. And that's what I love. Yeah. So let's do it again. You're going to knit 2. You're going to slip the next stitch purlwise. With your left hand needle, you're going to pick up from back to front the left leg of the stitch you just slipped underneath and knit it through the back. Ellen, yes, I would absolutely use this knitting sleeves in the round. Any place you see a make one, it's a clean bet that you could do an invisible lifted increase. You're going to knit until you reach the last 3 stitches. And now we're going to do the invisible lifted increase right. So without working anything, you're going to pick up the right leg underneath the next stitch that's about to be worked. And you're going to lift it right up onto the left-hand needle. And you're going to knit that stitch the regular way. And then you're going to slip the stitch. Then knit the last 2. If you're getting holes, because really what you could see here with the invisible lifted increase, what you're doing is right here, we have 2 stitches growing out of 1 stitch. That's where the new stitches are being incorporated. So if you notice that your piece has holes, when you are purling back, where I tell you to be careful not to accidentally purl these 2 together, when you go to purl these 2 stitches, give it a lot of tension. Purl 1, 2, even the next stitch, put some tension there, and that will close up any type of hole. And there is your invisible lifted increase. Does anybody have questions for me? I'm out of breath here. Remember, you're going to have this all recorded. You'll be able to watch it anytime. It'll be up on YouTube with a password. Someone's got to have a question. No. Thank you again so much for helping my friends, especially Natalia. She's very interested in this whole knitting thing. She's like, okay, like what's going on there? Like, I got to figure this out. But she cried, and we are so grateful for all of you. I mean, I know you guys are all wonderful people, but we were very shocked. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Marcy. Debbie, can you send us an email with that email address? Because I won't be able to get it from the chat box. So just send us an email with that email, and we'll get it to you. Anita, I love those lights behind you. Anybody else have any questions? Anything you want to see in the future?
This was great. I've never taken a class from you, so it was really fun.
Oh, well,
Learned a
thank
lot.
you. Thank you so much. Welcome to the family. We have
Those
fun
are-
around here, right, guys?
Well, it seems like you do. Those are my happy lights. I put them on.
I
when
love
knit.
them. Wonderful.
I
Oh,
actually enjoyed this more than the class on Monday.
what was Monday?
The tips and tricks by.
Oh yeah,
Master
well, that
knitting.
was more pertaining to a technique. This is
Yeah.
this is this is the class. I always say this is when I want to rally everyone up. This is the class I'm going to put up. It's also very funny because a lot of when I teach this class at Vogue or certain events, a lot of times people take it not knowing who I am and have never taken a class with me. And this this is kind of like my show off class, and they leave there thinking like, this was incredible. And then they probably sign up for other classes like with me and go, oh, it wasn't like that.
You know what? Every
Yeah.
class I've taken with you has been awesome.
You're a
Yeah.
great
Thank you.
teacher.
Totally
Great
agree.
teacher, Keith.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
Absolutely.
Much. Well,
And
yeah,
I
I'm
will
putting-
tell you, I get pulled on a lot to teach because I tend to approach things the way you do, more from a, you don't have to know the technical point. We can explain this without it. And that's what you tend to do. And so you don't lose people. And it's a great,
Thank
great
you.
class.
I went to college for special education. I just never actually did it. But maybe all those classes on like all
Oh, yeah.
my education
We are
class.
your,
really-
we are your special ed class.
There you go.
Please.
You know,
please.
another thing to try when you do the round, Keith, just, I don't know if you've ever tried it. I don't know where I learned this, but when you're doing your cast on, you cast on
Are you
one
gonna say
extra
slip a
stitch.
stitch and pass one over?
You pass over the beginning of your long tail cast on, and that closes it up really well
And
too.
that is, it's interesting because usually when people say a different way, like I'm very fast to be like, no, because but I will say it is equal to the one I showed. I have no problem.
Yeah.
With that too.
I disagree. I like yours better.
I think
like
yours is easier and less likely to lose a stitch.
Yes.
So when you go to close that gap, whether you knit two together or purl two together, the trick there is the trick on top of the trick, after you knit them together, pull the tail. And that's really going to close them.
Yeah.
But, what I love about this class is, I call it, Keith's mind-blowing tips and tricks, because it's all the things I wanted, all the things that loose edge stitch. I can't tell you how many years that bothered me. And like, I felt like it was always a gamble. Every time I bound off a project and I took the tail and tried to close the gap, because like I said, you're like in an endless hole of making it work.
Right.
You only have a few chances before you really start stretching things out and ruining the yarn. So I'm just glad we were able
I want the tip that says when you have a huge cast on for something in the round, that you're not going to be twisted.
Oh, well, that's one I want. And I want a tip for how to not cast on with your tail, because
I said that one too.
I laugh
Patty
at
Lyons.
myself.
Yeah, Patty Lyons has a tip for how to fix it if you did twist.
She has one.
Yeah, I took her class and I've used that tip, unfortunately, more times than not.
Now I know you can. Oh, you have the book. I didn't get my copy yet. I know you could fix it on the second round. Does she have a tip after that?
No.
Okay.
You're screwed.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to pick it up right away.
So yes, if you're twisted on the second round, you could fix it. But I guess after that, it's locked in.
Yeah.
They got mailed
Yeah.
out this week, Keith. I got mine on
Good.
Monday.
Then it should be.
Yeah,
I know
I got mine
it's on her
yesterday.
third printing already.
Which book is it?
It's Patty's Knitting Bag of Tricks.
Yeah.
Oh,
And it's basically this class in a book, but with 100 more things. So, and Patty's an incredible teacher.
It's also available on
She's-
Kindle.
Oh, is it?
oh, that's good to know. Yeah.
Yeah,
She's
I
the
got mine
one
on
who
Kindle.
really taught me
Deborah has
how
it
to
too.
look at your stitches and be able to say, hey, this one's backwards or this one's not. So I didn't always have to worry about whether I was going to twist a stitch, especially when you had done like a lot of ripping out. Sometimes they're not on the needle
It's
right.
always so helpful when you're able to read your knitting. That's also,
Yeah.
I think of something like last night I was teaching duplicate stitch, and you can't learn duplicate stitch unless you know the stitches. You have to know what the stitches look
They
like.
look like.
So,
Franklin Habit did all of the illustrations.
yeah.
And
Oh,
they're,
wow.
yeah, I didn't realize that he could do that stuff. It's really.
Oh, yeah, he love his little sheep things.
Yeah.
Have you ever taken any classes from Lucy Neatby? Neatby? Neatby?
I haven't. I don't think so.
Oh,
Yes.
she teaches some good classes. I don't know if she's still teaching, but she's hilarious.
What did she have that I did? I wonder if she had some kind of kit. I did.
Double knitting is something.
Double
she
knitting
excels
and
at.
socks. Socks is another one that she
I love
does a
how
lot of
everyone has like their
classes on.
little specialty thing of like,
Yeah.
okay, like I gravitate towards the finishing, but I do all the other tips and tricks. And
I know Patty is doing a class on Knit Stars on circular knitting hacks. So, and I think that's on sale through the end of this week.
yeah, then I think the new Knit Stars season just launched.
Yeah.
It's launching
Andy
November
Peters
1st.
has some classes
Right.
too.
What's the story with the cruise? Is it booked?
No, I think we're canceling it. I think
No.
I think we are going to do an on-land event.
Serious? I thought
Yeah,
you
we
said
just,
booked.
we didn't have a huge amount booked. And in the eyes of a cruise line, you need to have 16 in order to establish a group to get the meeting spaces. And I want to say it's because of COVID, but I know of other cruise people that have over 100 people. So I don't know what it is, but I know Chuck's looking right now at some places in Florida and maybe Vegas, and to do some type of on-land retreat in March.
Vegas is so cool.
I know, right?
Yeah.
I
I
mean,
did,
I love Vegas.
I did one a couple of years ago before the pandemic in Vegas, with my friend Samantha from Whimsical Wood Yarn Co. And we had a lot of fun.
That'd be awesome.
But I was just in Virginia too, for a show, and it was like crickets. So, but
Well, I think people are getting nervous because this is the time of year when COVID starts to peak itself
right
again. I know for me, I'm staying super close to home because I'm one of those people that can't get boosted and I have immune issues. So not a good time. I'm allergic to everything but Johnson & Johnson, and they took Johnson & Johnson off the market for boosters.
Oh, really? Oh,
But you don't want.
yeah, it's still a crazy time to be alive, but we are going to do that whole Keith and Shayna show thing. The funny thing is we kind of, we wanted to launch the Brioche Buddies event, but I have one of those big Zooms to do scheduled with Signature Needle Arts later this month. And I have a new yarn that I'm really excited about. I discontinued the mohair quite a while ago. And every once in a while, I get people asking for it. But basically the theme is it's itchy, it gets everywhere. I'm not too keen on dyeing it because it's a pain to dye and it gets all over the studio. But I got a brushed Surrey alpaca and silk. So it looks
nice.
Because the thing with mohair is you need that look, you need the fluffy hold on look, but it's not mohair, it's alpaca, and it's so incredibly soft. So
Just tell it's my cat hair.
You're coming out with periwinkle again?
Oh yeah, I'll dye some on periwinkle. I'll show you
I
this.
thought I saw it on your website.
Not the mohair, not the. I mean,
No, regular, just periwinkle color. The color.
Oh yeah, it's somewhere on the website. You can email me.
Yeah, I thought I just saw it
Look
again.
at this sweater that just came out. And so basically the thing is that this brushed Surrey could be used in place of mohair. So I love this sweater. I just found it the other day. So right here.
Oh, that is pretty.
Yeah, I like
sizes on that.
What I call a Keith sweater is a sweater that's basically stockinette, but has some interesting little detail. And what I love about this sweater is, it's a primarily stockinette sweater, but if you look at this neck insert with the mohair, and then it also has it at the cuff.
Gorgeous.
See right at the cuff right there.
I love that cuff.
And it just that little, it's almost like right there at the neck.
Gorgeous.
Here it is here. But instead of using the mohair, it will be the brushed Surrey. So it'll look like it, but it'll be softer.
What was that pattern called?
Let's see.
Are we doing a knit along with it?
What are the sizes?
I love it. It is called the size slow down sweater. Oh, so here it is while she was knitting it. How beautiful is that? I love that neck insert.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
And it goes up to a 60 to 62.
Wow.
Like it's a top down.
Awesome.
Worsted weight, and then it has the mohair. So if anyone has color recommendations, I'll take those. I only have 4 skeins of the Surrey. It's coming. I just have my sample skeins. So yeah, that would be a fun knit along.
Yeah.
Or pale blue.
But on another note, thank you so much again for supporting my friends and being here and supporting me. And until next time.
Awesome. Awesome.
It was great.
We love you.
We're back soon.
Well, thank you, everyone. If anyone's going to Rhineland, have fun, stay safe.
Much love. Much
We'll see
love
you
to you.
soon. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.